I have not spoken about this publicly in 14 years. My wife knows parts of it. My oldest son knows a little less than that. The full account, start to finish, I have never given to anyone, because the full account requires me to admit things about myself that I am not comfortable admitting, that I was afraid in a way I had never been afraid before, that the fear did not leave when it was over, that in some ways it has never fully left. I'm 61 years old. I spent 32 years as a wildlife conservation officer in the southern half of Missouri before I retired in 2019. I have handled nuisance bears, responded to livestock predation calls, tracked injured deer through bottomland in January, and spent more nights alone in remote terrain than most people spend outdoors in a lifetime. I tell you that not to impress you, but because it matters. What happened in the fall of 2010 near the 11-Point River country in Oregon County was not a misidentification. It was not nerves. It was not anything I can fold neatly into the categories I spent 3 decades working inside. What it was, I'm still not prepared to say with certainty. But I can tell you what I saw. I can tell you what we all saw. And I can tell you that the hunting party we organized to put an end to whatever was terrorizing those cabins did not end things the way any of us expected. The trouble started in late September with Lloyd Parson, who ran a small cluster of rental cabins on private timberland off a county road that most state maps did not bother showing. Lloyd had been renting those 4 cabins to deer hunters and turkey hunters for 20-some years without incident. The cabins were simple, clean structures set back about a quarter mile from each other in a heavily wooded area along a tributary of the 11-Point. Lloyd lived in a farmhouse about 3 miles out at the edge of the property, and checked on the cabins twice a week during the off-season and daily once hunting season opened. He was not a man prone to agitation. I had known him for years through my patrol district, and I would have described him as steady, methodical, the kind of man who processed problems quietly and only called for help when help was genuinely required. So when Lloyd drove to the district office in mid-October and told me he needed me to come look at something, I went without hesitation. What he showed me at the first cabin, the one furthest back into the timber, was enough to make me stop and collect myself before I said anything. The exterior wall on the north side had been damaged, not by a falling tree, not by an animal rubbing or clawing in any way consistent with what I knew bears to do in that part of Missouri. The logs had been struck with force at about chest height for a large man, maybe 5.5 feet off the ground, and the damage was horizontal in a pattern that suggested something had pressed against the wall or struck it repeatedly. The ground beneath the window on that side showed impressions in the soft earth that I crouched beside for a long time without speaking. I photographed them. I took measurements. The stride suggested something moving on 2 legs, and the depth was inconsistent with any human being of normal weight. Lloyd stood behind me while I worked and said nothing until I stood up. Then he told me the cabin had been empty that week. No renters, no one on the property after dark. He had found the damage on his Monday check and waited 2 days before coming to me because he had spent those 2 days trying to convince himself there was an explanation he was missing. He was not the kind of man who let things go unexplained. The fact that he had come to me at all told me more than the damage itself did. I walked the perimeter of that first cabin twice before I moved on to examine the others. There were scratch marks on the doorframe at the rear of the structure, deep lateral gouges in the wood at a height of roughly 7 feet that I photographed from multiple angles without being able to identify a source for them with any confidence. The marks were not consistent with bear clawing, which tends to be vertical and associated with bark stripping or territorial scoring on trees. These were deliberate and horizontal, spaced in a pattern that suggested individual digits rather than a swept paw. The wood around them was compressed rather than splintered, as though whatever had made the marks had pressed into the frame with sustained force rather than struck it in passing. I stood looking at those marks for a while, and then I walked the rest of the property with Lloyd and kept my thoughts where theirs belonged, which was to myself. Over the following 3 weeks, the pattern expanded. The second cabin showed similar disturbance around its exterior perimeter, branches torn from a cedar at roughly 7 feet, drag marks in the leaf litter that stopped at the tree line, as though whatever made them had simply stepped back into the forest and ceased to exist. A deer hunter named Gary Whitfield, out of Springfield, who had rented the third cabin for the first week of rifle season, came to find me at the district office on his third morning out. He was in his late 50s, a man I knew slightly from previous seasons, steady and experienced in the woods. He sat across from my desk and told me that something had circled his cabin for most of the previous night. He had lain in his bunk and listened to footsteps, not a shuffle or a pad, but a deliberate bipedal step moving around the perimeter of the structure at irregular intervals. He said the sound would stop for 15 or 20 minutes and then resume from a different position. He had looked out the window twice and seen nothing. He said the silence between the sounds was worse than the sounds themselves. He had his rifle with him in the cabin, and he told me that having it had not made him feel any safer. That last part stayed with me. Gary Whitfield had been hunting these hills since he was 12 years old. A rifle in his hands in the dark was the most natural thing in the world to him. Whatever he had heard moving around that cabin had stripped that comfort away from him completely, and that told me something important about what we were dealing with. I went back out to the property the next morning and spent 4 hours working the ground around Gary's cabin. I found what I was looking for on the northwest side, in a low spot where moisture had kept the earth soft despite the dry October we'd been having. 3 clear impressions in a line, each one roughly 18 inches long and 9 inches across at the widest point, with 5 distinct toe marks and a depth that I estimated would require something in the range of 400 pounds walking upright to produce. I say estimated because estimation was the only tool I had. No instrument I carried was calibrated for what I was looking at. I took photographs and I took measurements and I flagged the impressions with survey tape, and then I drove back to the office and sat at my desk for a long time before I wrote a single word in my incident log. What I eventually wrote was accurate as far as it went. It did not go nearly far enough. I began staying in the area after dark on my own time. I parked my truck on the county road and walked in through the timber on 3 separate nights in late October, positioning myself with a clear view of the cabin cluster and the surrounding ground. The first 2 nights produced nothing I could document. Sounds I attributed to the normal movement of deer and the distant call of a barred owl. A heaviness to the air on the second night that I noted in my personal log without elaborating, because I did not know how to elaborate on it accurately. There was a point on that second night, around 11 o'clock, when I became certain I was being watched. Not the vague unease that comes from being alone in the dark, which I had long since stopped feeling, but a specific, directed awareness that something nearby was oriented toward me and aware of my exact position. I sat with that feeling for close to an hour before it passed, and when it passed, it was not because anything moved or made a sound. It simply lifted, the way pressure lifts, and the timber went back to being ordinary timber, and I could hear the small things moving in the leaves again. I've thought about that moment many times since, about what it means that something can make itself known through pure attention without revealing itself in any way that could be measured or recorded. The third night was different in every respect. I had been in position for about 2 hours when the barred owl stopped mid-call and did not resume. I know that sound, the stopping of it. I have heard it happen when a predator moves through an area and the birds go silent in response, each species communicating absence to the others in a chain that ripples outward from whatever is moving. I stayed still and let my eyes work across the spaces between the trees. There was no moon to speak of, and the darkness under the canopy was close to total. What I detected first was smell, something organic and wrong. Not decomposition, not the musk of a deer or the heavy rank of a boar hog, something sharper underneath those things, something with an acid quality that sat at the back of my throat and did not dissipate, something I had no reference for in 32 years of field work. I registered it and stayed motionless. Then I heard it. A single footfall in the leaf litter, approximately 40 yards to my left, deliberate and weighted. Then silence, then another, slightly closer. Something was moving through the timber toward the nearest cabin, and it was moving upright. The footfalls were spaced far enough apart that I could calculate stride length, even in the dark, and the number I arrived at was not a number that fit anything I knew. I did not move. Every instinct I had developed over 3 decades of working alone in the dark told me to stay exactly where I was and let my senses do their work before my body did anything. The footsteps continued, not hurried, not exploratory the way a deer moves when it is uncertain of terrain. These were measured. They had a cadence to them that I can only describe as intentional, as though whatever was walking understood the geometry of the ground beneath it and was placing each step with full awareness of what it was doing and why. The smell intensified as it moved closer to the cabin. I had my flashlight in my left hand and my sidearm on my hip, and I touched neither. The footsteps stopped at approximately 20 yards from the cabin wall. There was a long pause, the kind of pause that has weight to it, and then I heard something I have turned over in my mind many times since that night. A low sound, not quite a growl, not quite a breath, something produced deep in a chest considerably larger than mine, and it held for 3 or 4 seconds before it stopped. Not a threat display, not alarm. Something more considered than either of those things. It sounded like assessment. Then the footsteps resumed, not toward the cabin, but laterally, moving along the tree line in a slow arc. Whatever it was reading the area. After perhaps 10 minutes, it moved back into the timber, and the night went quiet again in that particular way that means a predator has passed through and the smaller things are waiting to be certain it is gone. I drove back to my house that night and sat at my kitchen table for a long time before I wrote anything in my log. What I wrote was careful and measured and did not include what I actually believed I had heard, because I did not think belief had a place in an official record. But I knew what I had been sitting 40 yards from in that timber. I knew it the way you know certain things that your training has no language for. The body understands before the mind is willing to catch up. I had been in the field long enough to know the difference between an animal that does not know you are there and an animal that knows exactly where you are and has simply decided what to do about it. Whatever had walked that perimeter that night fell into the second category without question. It had not been startled by my presence. It had not altered its path because of me. It had moved through that clearing with the unhurried confidence of something that does not expect to be challenged, and the understanding of what that meant settled into me slowly over the drive home, and it did not lift in the days that followed. It was Gary Whitfield who first proposed the hunting party. He had returned to the cabins for a second week, despite what he had experienced, which told me something about his character, and by that point, 3 other hunters who had rented the remaining cabins were all reporting similar disturbances. Footsteps in the night, the smell, damage to exterior structures that could not be attributed to any animal they recognized. One man, a retired highway patrol officer named Dennis Craw from Poplar Bluff, had seen something briefly through his cabin window just before dawn on his 4th morning out. He described it as a shape moving upright between 2 trees at the edge of the clearing, too tall for a man, and moving with a fluid, unhurried ease that he said made the hair on his forearms stand up, even in the telling. Dennis was not a man who frightened easily. He had worked traffic fatalities and violent crime scenes for 26 years and had seen things that would have broken most people. He said what he saw, plainly and without embellishment, and I believed him completely, not because I needed corroboration by then, but because the precision of his description matched what I had been carrying around in my own head for weeks. The hunting party that assembled on the first Saturday of November consisted of 6 men. Gary and Dennis, 2 other hunters who had been staying at the cabins, a local farmer named Carl Britton, who knew that stretch of timber better than any man alive, and myself. I was present in a personal capacity, not an official one, and I want to be clear about that because what happened that night was not a sanctioned operation, and the report I eventually filed with my district supervisor reflected considerably less than the full account. We met at Lloyd's farmhouse at 4 in the afternoon. Carl laid out a topographic map on Lloyd's kitchen table, and we discussed approach routes, stand positions, and communication protocols. Lloyd stayed at the house. He had seen enough by then and had no interest in seeing more. He made coffee and kept it coming and did not ask questions, and I was grateful for that. The plan was straightforward. We would position ourselves in a loose perimeter around the cabin cluster, beginning at last light, and maintain our positions through the night, using handheld radios to communicate at 15-minute intervals. If something moved into the area, we would have overlapping fields of visibility and enough combined experience and firepower to address whatever the situation required. That was the language we used: address the situation. None of us said out loud what we expected to find, because saying it out loud in Lloyd's kitchen under the fluorescent light felt like a step none of us were quite ready to take. We moved into position as the last gray light was leaving the sky. The temperature had dropped into the upper 30s, and the timber was still, the kind of stillness that settles in when the wind dies and the night hardens around everything. I took a position on the northeast corner of the clearing, using a large white oak as cover, with a sight line across the open ground between the first and second cabins. Carl positioned himself further back in the timber to the west, where a dry creek bed gave him a natural corridor to observe. The others spread out along the southern and eastern approaches. We checked in by radio at 7 o'clock, and everything was quiet. We checked in again at 7:15. Still nothing. The cold was working into my boots by 7:30, and I was shifting my weight carefully to keep circulation moving when the smell reached me. The same smell from the week before. That sharp organic wrongness underneath something heavier and animal. It came from the northwest, carried on a light drift of air that barely moved the bare branches above me. I keyed my radio twice, the signal we had agreed on for contact, and settled my weight back against the oak and waited. The waiting was the worst part, not because nothing happened, but because of the quality of the silence that preceded what did happen. The timber around that clearing went from ordinarily quiet to something categorically different over the course of about 4 minutes. The small sounds that you stop consciously registering after a while in the field, the distant rustle of a mouse in the leaves, the creak of a branch settling, the occasional soft adjustment of a roosting bird, all of it simply stopped. It did not fade. It stopped, the way sound stops in a room when someone walks in and the conversation dies. I have been in the field in the dark for most of my adult life, and I have felt that particular silence maybe 4 or 5 times total, and every time it has meant the same thing. Something significant is close, and everything smaller has gone still in response. It is the oldest alarm system in the world, and it has never once been wrong. I heard Carl's voice come low and broken through the radio, 2 words that he did not finish, and then static. Then Dennis, from the southern position, said something in a tone that carried even through the poor transmission quality, a tone that had no room in it for doubt or question. Then, from somewhere between the first cabin and the tree line to my left, I heard the footsteps begin. They were not the careful, measured steps I had heard the week before on my own. These were slower, more deliberate, each one placed with a patience that had something almost contemptuous in it, as though whatever was moving understood that we were there and was entirely unconcerned by that fact. I raised my rifle and put my eye to the scope and looked into the darkness between the trees and saw nothing that my scope could resolve into a shape. Only shadows layered on shadows and the dull gleam of frost beginning to form on the ground between the cabins. The footsteps stopped, not gradually, not with the trailing hesitation of an animal losing interest, but completely and without transition, as though a switch had been thrown. 1 step, and then nothing, and the nothing that followed was so absolute that I became aware of my own breathing in a way that made me want to stop it entirely. I held my position against the white oak and kept the rifle up and watched the darkness between the cabins and waited for the next thing to happen. It did not happen where I was watching. It happened to my right, close enough that I felt it before I heard it, a displacement of air and a sudden intensification of that smell that made my eyes water, and then a sound directly beside me that I can only describe as breathing, slow and measured and produced by something standing no more than 8 or 10 feet away in the dark on the other side of the oak I was pressed against. I did not turn. I want to be honest about why. It was not tactical discipline, though I told myself later that it was. It was the understanding, arrived at in the space between one heartbeat and the next, that turning would constitute acknowledgement, and that acknowledgement would change whatever calculation was happening on the other side of that tree. I stood with my back against the bark, and my rifle pointed into empty space, and I listened to something breathe beside me in the dark for what my watch later told me was 40 seconds, and what my body told me was considerably longer than that. The breathing was not labored. It was not the rapid, shallow breath of an animal that has been running or that is frightened. It was slow and even, and it had a depth to it that spoke of a chest built on a different scale than anything I had stood next to before. And then it stopped, and the footsteps resumed, moving away from me now, back toward the northern tree line, unhurried and deliberate and fading until there was nothing left of them. I keyed the radio and said one word, and Gary responded immediately from the third cabin position. He had heard it pass through his area minutes before I had, moving east along the clearing edge. Dennis confirmed contact from the south, describing the same lateral movement, the same quality of deliberate, unhurried passage. Carl's voice came through last, lower than the others, and with something careful in it. He said he had seen it cross the creek bed to the west in a gap between two sycamores where starlight reached the ground. He said it was upright. He said it was tall. He did not say anything else, and none of us asked him to elaborate because the silence that followed told us everything we needed to know about what Carl Britton, who had spent 60 years in those woods and feared nothing that lived in them, had seen in that gap between the sycamores. We regrouped at the second cabin 30 minutes later, 6 men standing in the cold under a sky that had gone fully black, and not one of us spoke for the first minute or two. Gary finally said that whatever we had come out here to address, he was not certain we were equipped to address it, and that was the most honest thing said that night. Dennis agreed. Carl said nothing, which for Carl was the equivalent of strong agreement. We made the decision by something close to consensus, without anyone having to say it plainly, that the hunting party was finished, and that what we had encountered in those woods was not something that was going to be resolved by 6 men with rifles standing in the dark. We walked back to our vehicles in a tight group, and nobody spoke much on the way, and nobody looked back, or if they did not mention it. I stayed in touch with all 5 of those men over the years that followed. Gary sold his hunting lease in the 11-Point country the next spring and took up fishing instead. Dennis transferred to a desk position within a year of his retirement, and as far as I know, he has not spent a night in the field since. Carl Britton continued working his farm until he passed in 2017, and his daughter told me at the funeral that he had stopped running his trapline on the western edge of the property after that fall, and would not say why. The 2 other hunters, men I knew less well, both stopped renewing their Missouri non-resident licenses and did not return. Lloyd Parson closed the cabin rental operation at the end of that season. He listed the property for sale the following spring, sold it at a loss to a timber company, and bought a house in West Plains and has lived there ever since. I drove out to that property one more time after everything was over, in the middle of a February afternoon when the sky was flat and white and the timber was bare. I told myself I was going to document the site properly, make a final record of the track impressions and the structural damage for my personal files, close the matter out in a professional way. That was true as far as it went. The other reason, which I have not admitted to many people, was that I needed to see the place in daylight and in stillness, and confirm to myself that it was only a piece of ground, that whatever had happened there was attached to the specific conditions of those fall nights, and not to the land itself. I parked on the county road and walked in through the bare timber and stood in the clearing for a while with my hands in my coat pockets and looked at the cabins with their windows dark and their doors closed and their walls marked in ways that no official report would ever accurately describe. It was only ground, frozen ground in February with last year's leaves tamped down under a skim of old snow and the sycamores pale against the gray sky along the creek. It was only a clearing in the timber with 4 empty cabins and the marks of something that had been there. I stood in it for maybe 20 minutes, and then I walked back to my truck and drove home and did not go back again. The file I kept on the incident sits in a box in my garage. My wife knows the box is there. She has never asked me what is in it, and I have never offered to tell her, and in 22 years of marriage, we have built a comfortable understanding around the things that are better left in boxes in garages. What I have never been able to set aside entirely is the question of what that thing was doing out there. Not what it was. I have made a kind of peace with not being able to answer that question, but what it was doing. The cabins it circled were not food sources. They were not in its direct path between water and shelter in any way that made ecological sense. It had been returning to that specific cluster of structures repeatedly over the course of weeks, circling them, examining them, marking the territory around them in ways that suggested ownership rather than curiosity. The hunters inside those cabins had reported being watched through windows, had described the particular sensation of directed attention from outside that Gary and Dennis and Carl had all confirmed. Whatever that thing was, it had been observing those structures and the people in them with a consistency and purpose that went beyond anything I could explain as territorial instinct. It had been learning something. I do not know what. I am not certain I want to know. The other thing I have never resolved is the moment beside the white oak, the 40 seconds of breathing on the other side of the bark while I stood motionless with a rifle in my hands and did not turn. I have reconstructed that moment many times, turned it over the way you turn over a piece of evidence that does not fit the case you are building. What I keep returning to is the possibility that it had already seen me long before it came to stand beside that tree, that it had known my position from the moment I walked into the clearing, had tracked me through the timber, had cataloged me the way a careful thing catalogs an unknown element in its environment, and that what happened beside that oak was not coincidence but conclusion, the end of an assessment that had been ongoing for some time, and that whatever conclusion it reached had determined the outcome of that night for all 6 of us. I retired in 2019 after 32 years. My pension is modest but sufficient. I fish the 11 Point in the summers, and I keep a garden, and I have not spent a night alone in remote timber since that November in 2010, which is a thing I notice about myself without being able to fully account for it. I was not a man who feared the dark or the solitude of the field. That was a significant part of who I was for most of my adult life. Something shifted in that clearing, and the shift was permanent, and I have learned to work around it the way you learn to work around an old injury that healed wrong. You adjust your mechanics. You find ways to do the things you need to do without putting full weight on the part that does not work the way it used to. I am telling this now because I am at an age where the weight of carrying it alone has begun to exceed whatever I thought I was protecting by keeping it. Lloyd is gone from that land. Carl is gone entirely. The cabins have probably been logged off or let go to ruin by now. The county road that leads back in there is not on most maps, and the people who used to know it are scattered or passed. There is no case file, no official record that reflects what actually happened. There is only what 6 men experienced on a November night in Oregon County and what each of us did with it afterward. I do not know what lives in that timber along the 11 Point. I know what I heard standing against that white oak. I know what Carl saw cross the creek bed in the gap between the sycamores. I know that 6 experienced men with rifles and a reasonable plan went into those woods to address a problem and came out having addressed nothing, having resolved nothing, having only confirmed for themselves what each of us had already begun to suspect individually, that there was something out there that was not afraid of us, that had never been afraid of us, that had been watching those cabins and the people in them with a patience and a purpose that we did not have the framework to understand, and that whatever conclusion it had drawn about us, it had drawn it long before we drew any conclusions about it. I keep the file in the box in the garage. Some things are better left there. But I have come to believe, in the years since, that leaving something in a box does not mean it stops being true. It only means you have decided where to keep it. The timber along the 11 Point is still there. The creek is still there. Whatever moved through that clearing on those November nights is still out there somewhere in the deep country of southern Missouri, doing what it does, knowing what it knows. I think about that sometimes when I am out on the river in the early morning with the mist still on the water and the woods coming up dark and close on both banks. I think about it, and then I look at the water and I let the current take it, the way the current takes everything eventually. But it does not disappear. It only moves downstream, and sometimes, on the still mornings when the birds have not yet started and the mist lies flat on the water, I become aware of the tree line in the way I became aware of it that night, and I keep my eyes on the river, and I do not look into the dark between the trees.